Okay, I'll start by saying why I chose the clip, and it's for several reasons really, as well as having a lot of technical aspects to talk about. I think it's also the first time in the film where we really capture the essence of sort of Tim Burton and sort of see a darker side to the film. Um, in context to the rest of the film, this is sort of it's like a flashback within a flashback. Edward Bloom's son, Will, is thinking about his father telling him this story, and then we go sort of inside his father's head as well, so it all gets quite complicated, and which is really what the film is about, sort of how different people's perspectives um, change according to who's telling the story. Uh, we also see a lot of sort of scene changes which are quite significant. For example, the first thing you'll notice is the colour change between the bedroom scene and the swamp scene. It starts off really sort of warm red colour, which I feel shows how there's sort of, it's a loving atmosphere. It's sort of warm, it's nice, and then it changes to this sort of more eerie, colder blue atmosphere, which, as well as sort of showing that it's in the moonlight that they're walking, I feel it also just sort of adds to this the eeriness of the whole scene. I mean, it also goes quite well with the fact that it starts off in a bedroom, which is somewhere where we associate with love, and sort of the atmosphere and bedtime story, bonding with his father, to a swamp, which is a very stereotypically, it's very stereotypical horror setting. Um, we see a lot of shadows to set the scene. I mean, there's a whole theme of shadows throughout the whole thing, as well as having the flashlights in the swamp. We've got these hand puppets on the wall of sort of quite spooky things, and you sort of see it. It kind of makes the film a lot more dramatic, and sort of draws us into the fact that we're being drawn into a horror film. Um, the editing involved is quite sort of slow moving shots, which I think is for many reasons. Mostly it's because I feel that if it was faster cut, then it would make it into a more sort of actiony type scene, where I think the audience would be expected to jump, which is not really what I feel Tim Burton is trying to get across. I think he's trying to make it sort of, by making it slower and moving shots, it's maintaining the interest of the film, whilst at the same time sort of creating this slow, eerie, building up really slowly to this climax at the end of the scene. Of this really, the only fast shot in the scene is this really fast zoom shot in on the witch, and then sort of a very quick sort of trombone shot on Edward Bloom to show his facial expressions and his shock. But apart from that, it's all these zooms or tracks which are following them deeper into the sort of no-go zone. So it sort of shows also from where they've come from in this sort of, well, I mean, in the start of the scene, it's a bedroom, into this sort of witch's house, just to sort of really slowly build it up. I feel that the scene is omniscient in the way that we see everything that's going on in the storyteller's head. However, we don't know whether we can trust the storyteller himself. There's a lot of props in the scene which are quite significant. For example, the glass eye and the gargoyles, and I don't know whether you'd be able to count the shadows, but all adding to this atmosphere. And I feel that everything is very significant. We've got a lot of sort of animals like the cats, typically associated with a witch, and this sort of gothic dress, and it all adds to this sort of gothic atmosphere and lets us know what sort of witch this is. And it does tend to be, well, it seems to be a very stereotypical witch, and it just adds to this magic realism. Although he's telling it as a factual story, or what he believes is factual, it's actually got a lot of magic realism in it that we know couldn't exist, but he talks about it so normally and so naturally that it is as if it could. From the sound side of things, we've got a good mix of diegetic and non-diegetic sound to add to the atmosphere. The first thing you'll notice is a sound bridge, which sort of I feel is to slowly draw us into the story. So it starts off complete reality. He's telling this story. Slowly we go inside his own head while he's still narrating, and then eventually the narration cuts out and we're fully absorbed into the story, which gives us this sort of nice smooth transition. We've got the creaky gates and things like that, which all add to the atmosphere. The screeching cats. We've got a lot of owls and insects to let us know where we are. and also maintaining this eerie atmosphere. Then from the non-diegetic sound point of view, we've got a lot of violins playing. Nothing very shocking. It's all quite slow right up until this sort of climactic point of the scene where the witch opens the door. And then at the end of the scene, we've also got a sound bridge, as well, a sort of sound and visual bridge, I suppose, because, you know, one door closes and another opens, which is sort of a nice way to bring us out of the scene quite gently, I feel, and sort of bring us in back to reality. It lets us know we're in a different place whilst maintaining, you know, quite a nice transition to the next scene. The representation in this scene, I feel, is really interesting because obviously, as it's inside his own head, Edward Bloom's head, it's going to be a different representation to reality. And also there's this sort of father-son relationship, so you sort of know that this son is going to be really proud of his father, because all sons are at that age, and it just brings him out to be such a hero. You know, it's the first time in the film where we see him acting so heroically. He is the first person to step up and say, you know, I'm going to go into the witch's house, and he's the hero of all his friends. And the way that he tells the story, there's nothing in the story that suggests that he's remotely not a hero. And as he's telling it to his son, you know, this is going to be further exaggerated in his son's head, and, you know, I'm sure his son will go and sort of tell all his friends what a hero his dad is, as they always do. So I think it's quite significant in many ways for that, in that point of view. And as we see, it is totally different to reality in modern day life. When the son grows up, he's sort of realised his dad's flaws, and he doesn't really like his dad very much, and he's realised that it is sort of just lies, or at least exaggerations of the truth. As for target audience, the certification is PG. However, I feel that children, I don't think, would like it as much as sort of the under 30s. On IMDb, it was under 30, up between 18 and 30 years old, that would like it the most, with no preference to sex. And I feel that this is for many reasons, mainly because it's sort of like, it's described as a fairy tale for adults. And I think that's because, as well as having all these fairy tale elements, you know, giants and witches, it also deals with quite mature things. You know, we've got a lot of death of a loved family member, whilst maintaining this, you know, this total fantasy, which is very Tim Burton-esque of the whole film, which, yeah, I feel is quite significant, and it is enjoyable to watch as an adult, and at the same time you can feel as though the film is designed for you, like you're not watching a children's film. And this sort of split narrative also adds to that, but I'll get to that later. As for genre, it was described on IMDb as adventure, drama and fantasy, with a lot of magic realism aspects, which I've already talked about. Obvious reasons it's adventure, as he, you know, he's gone on this sort of lifetime adventure. When he gets offered a place to stay and stop his adventure, he says, no, I want to carry on with this with this adventure. A lot of drama with it. Mainly, I'd say the drama actually occurs in the reality aspect of the film. As you know, we've got these mature subjects that we've talked about earlier. You know, the death, and, you know, falling out with your father, and then obviously this typical fantasy which we see in so many of Tim Burton's films. You know, it's so similar to sort of Alice in Wonderland, or a lot, you know, like A Nightmare Before Christmas, where this sort of naive sort of hero is heading out into this big world where, I mean, a lot of it's made up by himself, but in his own head, you know, it's this adventure of a lifetime. And obviously so much of it is magic realism, which adds to the fantasy element of it. You know, we've got a Siamese twin, Vietnamese characters, or a giant or a witch, and the witch turns out to be someone else, and it's so sort of complicated and so made up that it couldn't possibly be real. But then to him, you know, we see him tell the stories with such a serious face that you don't assume that you can trust him, because he's shown in a trusting light. He's not the villain of the film. As for the narrative, it's non-linear and split narrative, as we've got reality merging with the stories that are being told to us from inside our main character's head. it's omniscient, but as I said before, it's omniscient as we're shown everything that's going on inside his head. But then obviously you can't really he's not a very trustworthy character. So I mean, we don't know the true version of events, but we you know, we do know what he's thinking of, and we're showing it in full. As for Vladimir Prop's theory of characters, we've clearly established a hero being Edward Bloom, but he's sort of a self-confessed hero. The villain would probably be his childhood friend Wilbur Freely, I believe, as he tries to sort of stop him. He's the one that takes his girlfriend, and he does seem to come across in quite a negative light for all of the film. You know, right from this scene that I'm analysing, he's saying, "Oh no, you won't do it. You won't do that," and he's taking a sideways sort of stance. He's not being the hero at all. The helper would be, I'd say, it would be the giant Carl, as he's sort of his companion. The donor, it would be the circus master, I think, as he's the one that's sort of providing this information about this girl, and sort of, although he's actually abusing the hero, Edward Bloom, being so naive and sort of optimistic, he feels that he's actually being a very good friend, which in the end he does turn out to sort of pull through. The princess clearly is Edward Bloom's wife, or future wife, in parts of the film. Very sort of typical princess. You know, she's the sort of trophy wife, if you like, you know, the trophy for going through all this sort of hardship. There is no father in the film, really, unless you're talking about in the reality sense of things. But really, I mean, Will Bloom isn't much of or isn't portrayed as much a hero until right at the end. And as for the dispatcher, there's not really a character playing the dispatcher except for Ed Bloom himself, because he's sort of his own dispatcher. You know, he's sending himself out on this quest, even though he does several times get offered a chance to stay behind, and there's no real reason why he has to, but he sort of has got this drive to send himself on this sort of magic quest. The equilibrium theory works perfectly, as well. In the start of the film, it starts at a wedding, and then we realise later on that he falls out with his father early on, which is sort of the start of the modern day disruption of equilibrium, and then we find out he's dying, which sort of complicates the plot. But also inside his own head, it starts off in equilibrium. You know, he starts off inside Ashton, then he suddenly grows up, and he realises that he's intended for bigger things, and sort of he disrupts his own equilibrium and sends himself out on this quest. I'd describe the film as a Candide, a Romeo and Juliet, and a Tristan. The reason for Candide is because it's sort of, you know, this innocent outside his comfort zone. He's got very naive optimism and feels like he should be a hero. And I mean, the name Big Fish suggests, you know, he's intended for for bigger things, as he says, and so he sends himself out. Romeo and Juliet, as Ed Bloom meets his wife and then loses her almost instantly. I mean, without saying a word, she doesn't even really see him, which is very sort of typical Romeo and Juliet. And Tristan, because the boy meets the girl and eventually, after 3 years, and then finds out that she's actually engaged. So I think it fits in with those three very well, but not many of the other narrative theories. Historical and institutional aspects would be, it's very typical Tim Burton film in many ways. Maybe not as dark as you know, The Nightmare Before Christmas or Edward Scissorhands or Sweeney Todd, but there are definitely aspects of it. You know, we've got this, we've got the giant and this witch scene, which I've talked about, which is very, very typical Tim Burton. Dark lighting, magic realism, as with all of his films. You know, Alice in Wonderland, Charlie and the Chocolate Factory. It's all got this very, I mean, it's very similar, the way in which it's made. So yeah, that's it. Thanks for listening.